Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
This is the fifth in an irregular series of talks presented by the Wellness Department. We're going to kind of chat about some historical things today. And since February is Black History Month, Andrea asked me to talk about Black history. So that's what we're going to talk about today. After she's told me that, I thought, well, I know a few things, and I can find the Urban League and the NAACP sites, and they will give me a lot of good pointers, and they did. And a lot of what I looked at, I was thinking, you know, I've heard all this before. I didn't actually, internalize all of it, but if I recognize it, half the audience has heard it. So maybe I ought to start thinking about this a little bit. And instead of starting with Dr. King and Mrs. Parks, thought, well, maybe I should go back a little bit. Before them would have been the Jim Crow era. Before that, Reconstruction. Before that, U.S. slavery. Before that, European and African slavery. Before that, Egyptian, Babylonian times. And then it hit me. For myself, I was asking the wrong question. What I really needed to ask is, where did Black history start? Where did we get this idea of blackness and whiteness? I don't know. I had some ideas. I had learned some things. Heard some things from some preachers. I heard some things from school. I started digging. Discovered I didn't know nearly as much as I thought. I found papers and lectures written by racists on either end of the spectrum. White people who said all blacks are evil, and black people who said all whites are evil. Religious people who said they had religious reasons for why there were races. And it was hard to try to separate, the prejudices from the facts. And so I had to go through a lot of different things, and I'd see, oh yeah, a lot of people say this same thing. That implies that maybe it's correct. Doesn't prove it. There were some good scientific sources. There were some good historical sources from some historians I've learned to trust. By the way, I'm not a historian. I'm a retired engineer. I enjoy reading history. So what you're going to learn today is I'm going to present almost everything I have learned about Black history. So don't ask me very many questions, because I won't know if I know what I've got it in the slides. But by the time I ended my preparation, got the slides ready, I had come up with some heart-wrenching questions that I had to ask myself. Haven't got them all answered. An hour from now, I'm going to present you with some of those heart-wrenching, or one of those heart-wrenching questions. See where you go with that. That's up to you. So where did whiteness and blackness come from? How did blackness get into the human race? What better source than the Catholic Church? Go take a look at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and we see a Caucasian god giving the spark of life to a Caucasian Adam. What better reference could there be? By the way, if you're interested in this, there is an excellent book. The author's name slips me. It's called Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling. Pretty substantial book. Just goes into all of the study and the theology and so on behind each one of the paintings in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Well worth your reading. So here we see the beginning. We go a few years later, and Adam and Eve have sinned, and the artists uniformly show that this Caucasian Adam with his Caucasian Eve are thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden is now protected by a group of Caucasian angels. All these artists couldn't be wrong. So I thought about it a while more. And I realized that the human race funneled through Noah. So what about Noah? Well, we find that Noah was Caucasian, and so were his 3 sons. I mean, what better reference of an authority could we have than the Lego Corporation? Obviously, Noah was Caucasian, and so were his sons. Now you remember from reading the scripture in Genesis, that after they got off of the ark, Noah went into the grape business. And after a few years of making grapes and making wine, he had learned to make wine. And in the particular day in question, he was enjoying his wine. He enjoyed way too much of it. The Bible is very delicate in what it says. Don't know exactly what happened, but Ham behaved improperly relative to his drunken father. The other 2 boys did not. They were supportive of their father. When Noah came to, if you will, discovered what had happened, very upset, he pronounced a curse on his son Ham and the generations to follow. Strong tradition is that that is when blackness entered the race. Ham was set black so that his descendants would be black, and for all time we would know that black people were to be servants of white people. And you can read a lot of preachers who taught that, especially back in the 17 and 1800s, to justify slavery. Well, let's see about that. What happened to the descendants of Ham? We see the descendants of Ham, Canaanites, Egyptians, Chaldeans, Babylonians. They don't sound like a bunch of servants and slaves to me. Some great civilizations there. But didn't Noah pronounce a curse on his son and his descendants? Yeah. But I don't think the Lord did. Noah was enjoying at that time the Bible's only recorded instance of a hangover. I think Noah was speaking out of his own feelings, and he pronounced a curse without the Lord's permission. Well, that says about as much authority behind it as for me to pronounce a curse. You know, I could pronounce a great, wonderful curse against Georgia. Doesn't mean the Lord agrees with it. I don't think it happened. Noah did pronounce the curse. Didn't happen. Looking at all of this logic that we've talked to now about the Caucasianness of everything leading up to Noah, and then the blackness of Ham, there's a wonderful English word that describes that logic. 3 syllables. One of my favorite logic terms. Baloney. Baloney. No truth to any of it. Nothing you can justify. Most of it you can prove is wrong. Except the Legos part. Okay, I think the Legos company, we got to trust them. Well, let's look into this a little bit. Let's look at how what we call race. We're all one race. We're the human race. For this morning, for this afternoon, I'm going to pretend we're different races because that's just the way the language works best. Okay? Just the way the English language works best. Racialness is inherited. Heredity, in a nutshell, says if your grandparents didn't have any children and your parents didn't have any children, you probably won't have any children. Okay? All right. Yeah, that's heredity. When the Lord made humans, He built into us some mechanisms to adjust for changes. because God knew we were not going to be in the Garden of Eden forever. He would have liked it. That's the way he wanted it. So the Lord built into the human race a system that makes adjustments over the long haul. Good traits tend to be amplified. Notice I said tend, that's a very soft word. Bad traits tend to be minimized. So the Lord has built an automatic adjustment process for many things into the human body. And let's look at some things that relates to. Vitamin D. Where does vitamin D come from? The sun. Okay. Ideally, we would get our vitamin D from the sun. Nowadays, long sleeves, SPF 75, working inside. So we have to get our vitamin D from somewhere else. Number one food for vitamin D is fish. All my life I have tried to eat fish. I have finally gotten so I can endure it. I know it's good for me. And once in a while in the dining room I will order fish and I will make myself eat it. Because I know it's good for me. My mom could make beef, liver, and onions. Liver and onions. I even wrote a song about my mom's liver and onions. And we'll all have liver and onions when she comes. And we'll all have liver and onions when she comes. Yeah, they were writing about my mom. So I got some vitamin D from liver. Unfortunately, when my mom died, she took the only copy of the recipe for good liver and onions to the grave with her. Okay, sorry dear, yours is okay, but not like my mom's. Guess who's going to sleep on the couch tonight? Next in line would be beef, way down, but beef does contain vitamin D. Cheese, grain. Oh, I love cheese. Been a little concerned about cheese because of cholesterol. Have you been reading the news lately? Notice the government has just said maybe cholesterol isn't as bad as we've been telling you it is for the last 50 years. Oh boy. Truth of the matter is, most of us get our vitamin D from multivitamins, from vitamin pills. Lack of vitamin D inhibits bone development. Aren't very many children here, so I'm not going to talk about rickets. But bone weakness and fractures. I don't know about you guys, but when I get in and out of the shower, I hang on to those grab bars carefully. I know if I fall, that is a big thing to break. Make sure you get your vitamin D. If you get it from Joanne's liver and onions and fish, that's good. Nothing else, make sure you take your multivitamins. Another item that we're concerned about is folic acid, also known as folate. Green leafy vegetables. Do you order the chef salad in the dining room every now and then like I do? Good stuff. Green leafy vegetables, fruits, nuts, beans, dairy products. All very easy to get your folate. But notice I put a different sun up here. Well, they're getting there on the PA system for us. Folate is destroyed by sunlight. So if we get out in the sunlight, our body starts to go short on folate. So we got a balancing act going on here. Vitamin D and folate. let's wait just a minute. Thank you. Okay. Now maybe my throat will behave a little better. Folic acid, good way to get that is from green leafy vegetables. You all eat the chef salad in the dining room. Joanne makes a good chef salad. Actually, I guess it's Chef Jared that makes it, but anyway. Fruit, nuts, beans, dairy products, all good stuff. So it's easy to get enough folic acid. The problem is the sun destroys folic acid. So you get out in the sun to get vitamin D, and the sun tears down your folic acid. Low on folic acid leads to birth defects. If a woman is low on folic acid before and during pregnancy, it makes a much greater percentage chance of birth defects. Both men and women, low fertility. Now look at the last two here. Higher incidence of strokes and depression, all from low quantities of folic acid. Balancing act here. So, is sunlight good or bad? Okay, sunlight is wonderful for vitamin D, but it's not so good when you're talking about folic acid. When the Lord made us, came down through Noah, what was the command he gave Noah? Be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. And what did the following generations do? Stayed clustered right together, and when they saw that some of the people were starting to spread out, they said, let us build a tower unto heaven so that we can all stay here together. The Lord said, that's not what I told you to do. So the Lord confused the languages. So, John and Mary Mason got up one morning, and they could talk to each other just fine. They could talk to the kids. And John headed off to work with his peanut butter sandwich and a bottle of Pepsi. And the boss got up to give assignments, and the boss said, so the boss says, points to John, and John says, and the boss, you get the idea. They couldn't talk to each other. They couldn't finish the tower. The crews couldn't even talk to each other. They couldn't even do business with each other. So they gradually started to move away, which is what the Lord had told them to do in the first place. Well, up until this time, vitamin D and folic acid had been well balanced, just like the Lord had built it. And when some people moved to the east, nothing changed. And when other people moved to the west, nothing changed. But what about those people who moved to the north? They moved to the north, and what happened? As they were moving north, hundreds and hundreds of miles over the generations and the centuries, they were getting less sunlight. That's great for folic acid. It's not so great for vitamin D. What about the people who were headed south? That was great. They were getting more vitamin D, but not enough folic acid. The Lord knew what was going to happen. The Lord put something in the skin called melanin. And when the people moved south, and their body was getting too much ultraviolet, that mechanism the Lord put in started generating more melanin, stopped out a great deal of the ultraviolet, and guess where it balanced out? Right where vitamin D and folic acid were correct. The people who moved north, south, which way did I say it? The opposite direction, the same thing happened. The amount of melanin in their skin over the generations went down. So, what is the result of this? It really doesn't matter. Over the long haul, the Lord had built the human body so that the amount of melanin would adjust, so that the amount of folic acid and the amount of vitamin D was going to balance over the long haul. Interesting. I thought, well, there goes that idea about Ham being the instantaneous beginner of slavery and blackness and so on. Turns out it was just the way things were. But that begs the question. When did we start thinking in terms of some people are whiteness and some people have blackness? Well, trying to figure that out, looking at archaeological things, we can learn a little bit, but melanin doesn't fossilize. So you're not going to learn a lot about color by looking at archaeological remains. You'll get a rough idea of what society looked like at a given site. You know, you can tell whether they had houses and stores and stuff, usually. You can see the remains of grain or of bones of animals and stuff. Get a pretty good idea of at least what century they lived in at that site. And that was really about the best we could do until about the last 40, 30 years, when DNA was discovered. DNA, millions of little markers in DNA. And as DNA is passed from parent to child, it is essentially Xeroxed from one generation to the next. But there are little differences that go along. I mean, your children, do they look exactly like you? No, they look some looks that they got from somewhere back in your ancestry. How many of us have run into people that had a mother and father with blue eyes, and lo and behold, they had a brown-eyed child? I mean, everybody who's taken 10th grade biology knows that's impossible. But it's not. Very small chance, but it does happen. And we understand the reasons why it does happen. Occasionally, something like literally a cosmic ray will hit a person and change just one of these little points in the millions in a DNA. And it just happens that that DNA is the one that gets passed on to a child. Can't tell the difference at all. It is so tiny. But all of their descendants from then on show that marker. And so if you dig up a grave of me and you find something really weird in my DNA that nobody's ever seen before, and then you dig up a grave of my great-great-great-grandchildren, lo and behold, that same marker is there, a century apart. They must be my children. And you dig up a grave of Michael and Joan's great-great-great-great-grandchildren, the marker isn't there. Huh, they must not be Cecil's descendants. It's not a real exacting tool, but it does give us an idea, a way to tell about migration over the centuries. We play this backwards and look for where did the human race first show up in the genetic records. And we find that that was in the area that is modern-day Kenya. Interesting, huh? Probably. There's a little room for deviation there, but nearest anybody's been able to tell, and this has stood for about 10 years now, we think that the human race, probably funneling through Noah, started in Kenya. And maybe what he called Mount Ararat was something we call Mount something else now, I don't know. So what did Adam and Eve look like? Adam and Eve almost certainly were sort of a medium color. Nowadays, those of us who are white would probably call them black. Those who are black might call them light. I don't know. They weren't white. They weren't black. They were just human. Just human. Race, as we are talking about it today, didn't exist. When did color start to matter? Well, we can see things from 3,000 years ago. We see that the Egyptians were a mixture of people who were very dark. Here we see Prince Rehotep, very dark brown, and his significant other, pale pink like me. Nobody seemed to care. It was just the way it is. How things have changed. As I was rummaging around, I came across some interesting advertisements. On screen left, you see the art I took, or the photograph I took, from an ad advertising pills that dark-skinned people could take so they could have lighter skin. Okay. And on the right, from an ad that white-skinned people could get a lotion to make them dark. Nobody's happy with what they've got. At least there are enough people who aren't happy that they'd like to move to the other direction. I'm confused. I don't know a lot more than I did when I started. All of this stuff really doesn't show where blackness and where discrimination entered the human race. But I thought it was real interesting. I would like to talk the rest of this afternoon, about some important black people as picked by me. Okay? It's my talk. I picked them. A couple of modern day heroes who happen to be black. Not Superman, not even the Lone Ranger in Tonto. One of my heroes was going to be here today and he wasn't able to make it. Our own Walter Hayden. When I first moved here, we started attending chapel, and there were just so many wheelchairs that needed to be moved. So I checked on how to become a volunteer. Went over and talked to Melissa Bushing, became a volunteer. Began helping the people move wheelchairs. So I began learning a lot of the names of people over in healthcare. I was working with a lady, very, very limited, by the name of Estelle. Ernestine. Where's Mrs. Wick? I did it again. By the name of Ernestine. You know, there are about 100 people over there, so a lot of them, I just didn't know them very well, didn't know anything about their story, just knew they needed to be places, and it was my job to move their wheelchair here and there, wherever the medical people told me. And every once in a while, I would see Walter over there helping out. And then it dawned on me after a while, he was usually helping with the same lady. Oh, that's interesting. Must be, one of his relatives. And then I gradually found out the rest of the story. Here we see Walter and Ernestine in much younger years. Wonderful family. And you look at Ernestine, yeah, I know that lady. It's still Ernestine. Yeah. They took each other for better or worse, in sickness and in health. And as the years went by, they had a lot of good years. And then Ernestine's health gradually slipped, and her mind gradually slipped. But Walter's still there with her, sickness and health, for better or for worse. And I see him several times a week over there. Now I understand what he's doing. He's over there taking care of his sweetheart. And every time I see that, I say, Lord, let me be that good a saint if my wife is ever disabled. Maybe I just learned that you did something very similar caring for your mother. As of now, you are officially promoted to one of my modern day heroes. Now some interesting people that are known nationwide. Let's look at some entertainers. And the entertainers I've chosen here are not because they're spectacular, not because they did rags to riches or something, it's because I like them. Louis Armstrong, born in 1901. His family was poor. His mother was only 16, his father a little older. He was only a few months old when his father couldn't take it, and Mrs. Armstrong was left by herself taking care of little baby Louis. By the time he was 7, second grade, he was helping generate income for the family, going out on the street, selling vegetables and things. Time he was 11, he dropped out of school completely, worked full-time, really wanted to be a musician. Saved up enough money to buy a used cornet. And he began doodling around, teaching himself, hanging around outside of places where we would just as soon not have our children be. Learning to do the music, and then gradually inside the honky-tonks, playing along with the orchestra. Gradually learned, well, he's good, let's make him part of the orchestra. Now he's getting paid for it. And he was smart. He was becoming better and better and better at the horn, but he made sure he was never better than the guy at the top, so he didn't lose his job. Pretty smart, pretty smart. He was doing backup positions, gradually worked his way up, doing guest appearances, a movie here and there. And then the most interesting thing about Louis Armstrong, it's not his raspy voice singing "Hello, Dolly." When he was, again, in his early teens, he and a group of his friends formed a little band. And they performed around on the street corners and stuff for whatever money they could make. And each one of them had a nickname, so they each generated a nickname for themselves. And Louis, with his great big huge smile, they called him Satchel Mouth because he had a great big smile. Nothing derogatory about it, that was just his abbreviation. Abbreviated to Satchmo, and it stuck. So that's where the Satchmo came from. You may not have heard of the Nicholas brothers. You've probably seen a little of their work. Fayard and Harold, they combined dancing with aerobics, or acrobatics rather. Their trademark was doing a cartwheel, landing in a split, and then coming up without bending their knees. Very interesting. I did a little looking around for them. They appeared in two of the two movies that Glenn Miller did. And in the movie Sun Valley Serenade, they appeared with Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge was a singer and a dancer in her own right. Nothing compared to the Nicholas brothers. But in that movie, they did Chattanooga Choo Choo. And let's see if I can see where my mouse is. There it is. The first 5 minutes of this set is the band doing Chattanooga Choo Choo, Tex Beneke singing, and so on. And then at 4 minutes and 53 seconds, and notice this line of gibberish here. If you go to YouTube looking for clips, YouTube actually gives you the necessary code to put into your presentation so you can use their clips. Pretty neat. Anyway, at 4 minutes and 53 seconds, the camera pages screen right, and we begin to see Dorothy Dandridge strut onto screen. And here are the Nicholas brothers.
She said the Tennessee line. Jack, she means that she can't afford to
Miss Dandridge is a good dancer, and you'll see her here for a few seconds. About 60 seconds or a little over of her dancing. Now they start a regular Hollywood dance routine, and it's good. But you're going to see that the Nicholas brothers are really throttled down here. For about 7 or 8 years of my time with IBM, I was a railroad specialist. So I always enjoy these railroad songs. I have actually traveled part of the line that they sing about here. Now, for the Nicholas brothers to really dance without making Miss Dandridge look bad, they have to write her out of the scene. And that's what's happening here. And now they cut into some real dancing. And notice how the energy level gets more and more, where you and I would be getting so tired, we'd want to quit and sit down. They're going stronger and stronger. And believe it or not, this is the easy stuff. Okay, now watch. They're going to throw their hats to the audience, and then they're going to start really dancing. You ain't seen nothing yet. Look at that split. See him mount that? Jump over the railing, completely clear it, and down into a split and back up without bending their knees. Wow. Those of you who were at dinner the other night saw poor Monabelle trying to teach me how to do the chicken dance. Yeah, some of you saw that, huh? Yeah. Andrea sneaked out on us.
Yeah.
I was going to make a suggestion to her. Okay, here's what I want you guys to do. All of you, after the meeting, go down to Andrea's office and suggest that she add tap dancing to the exercise and the rock steady boxing. Okay? We'll have Monabelle do Dorothy Dandridge, and Bud Shyman and I will learn to do the Nicholas brothers. And for Root Beer Float, a couple of months from now, we'll do this routine that they just did. Yeah, right. One of my very favorite singer of all times, the King, the real King, Nat King Cole. Oh, I like him. Nathaniel Adams Cole, born 1919. Not a rags to riches story. He grew up in a normal Baptist pastor's home. He was a musician from the time he was a kid. Did his first performance at 4 years old, playing Yes, We Have No Bananas. And he just continued making good music as he grew up, learning more styles. Of course, growing up in the church, he did gospel music, jazz, classical. Don't normally think of Nat King Cole doing Rachmaninoff. But yeah, that was one of his favorites. I really like Nat King Cole. The very thought of you. Boy, he's good. How about some famous black women? Some women who did some very unusual things who happened to be black. Let's talk first about Bessie Coleman, born in 1892. Growing up, Bessie saw this new industry, aeroplanes, machines that could fly. And she wanted to learn to fly one. She went around trying to get into flight schools. The flight schools, well, she's black. Worse yet, she's a woman. She couldn't possibly learn to run an airplane. So she took up cosmetology. She learned to do fingernails and hair and all that kind of stuff. You know, just as talking to one of her customers, as women do in the beauty shop. She was talking to Mrs. Robert Abbott. And Mrs. Abbott took the story home to her husband. And he said, well, she should go to France. France doesn't discriminate against blacks or women. She could learn to fly there. So she enrolled, they suggested it to her. She enrolled in the Berlitz course and learned French specifically so she could go to France to learn to fly. And once she had enough French, Mr. and Mrs. Abbott and a few others chipped in some money to help her. She went to France, and she did. She learned to be a good, commercially rated pilot. She came back to the United States, and she couldn't get a job. Nobody would hire either a black or a woman to fly their precious airplane. After a while, she went back to France, learned to become a stunt pilot. I'll show them. She could do flight that none of the men in the U.S. could do. Now she came back to the United States and she didn't need their airline jobs or their post office jobs. The entertainment world was glad to have her because people would pay big money to come and see an air show. And they advertised her as being the greatest woman aviator in the world, and maybe she was. But would you take the word of Barnum and Bailey on something like that? I don't know that I would. After a few years, she and her mechanic were up testing an airplane. The mechanic was at the controls. Bessie was in the passenger seat, and there was a noise that they weren't sure of, and they were trying to work out a routine of how she was going to act, and they had to get this noise identified, so she disconnected her belt, open cockpit. You know, she's trying to figure out what that noise is. And a wrench vibrated into some of the gears of the engine. The plane lurched and she fell to her death. The mechanic was not able to recover control of the plane. He crashed and he died. So, Bessie Coleman was very good. She proved that a lot of people were wrong. Died way too young. Coming up to the modern era, a kid. Dr. Patricia Bath, born 1942, within just a few days of my birthday. Yeah, she had some problems being a woman, getting into the medical industry and being a black, but not nearly as bad as what Miss Coleman had had. Each step of the way, however, she was breaking glass ceilings. She became an MD, became an ophthalmologist. And as she was working with cataracts and other eye problems, reading modern science, she realized that with proper use of a laser, cataracts could be handled with a laser and not a knife. She invented the process, patented it. First black woman to have a medical patent. She was the first at almost every step along her career, and she still is. So she is still practicing. Let's look at some black people who were good guys. Good guys. People who helped law and order work. First one I'd like to talk about is a lawyer. Current Justice Clarence Thomas, born in 1948. Studied hard, went to school, got through college, got good grades, went to Yale Law School, graduated cum laude. So he did very well. He got out of law school and started looking for work. And he'd go in and the hiring guy'd say, yeah, right. We're supposed to believe that a black man got B's grades at Yale? Nah, you're just an EEO guy. You're just a affirmative action guy. We don't believe you. And he had a terrible time trying to find a job because people simply would not believe that he was really as good as his grades showed. Finally, one day, in frustration, he had a box of cigars and had a 15-cent marker on it for the price. He took the 15-cent label off, stuck it to the frame of his Yale Law School cum laude diploma, and said, this is all that Yale Law School degree is worth, 15 cents, because he just plain couldn't use it. So it took him a long time. He worked his way up, became a judge, again working his way up. He was on the top 5 list that President Bush had, and all the presidents do this. And I guarantee you President Obama has a list of half dozen people ready to appoint to the Supreme Court should something go wrong. Turns out he was the number 1 on that list. When did we need him? To replace Thurgood Marshall. So that took care of one problem. A lot of people were going to be concerned that a black man going off of the Supreme Court should be replaced by a black man coming on. Mr. Thomas, Judge Thomas, was finally confirmed. He's known as a textualist. It is his position that the Constitution means what the Constitution says, as opposed to the living document people who says the Constitution means whatever I feel like it should mean this week. Next ones I'd like to talk about are the Tuskegee Airmen, coming to World War II. You would think that 40 years later, after Bessie Coleman, some of the people would be admitting that, blacks are capable of flying. A lot of them didn't. The Army Air Corps wouldn't even take black pilots. Finally, they needed 2 pilots. So they said, okay, if a black man already knows how to fly, we'll let him into the Army Air Corps. Well, it turns out there were a few. And they formed the 99th Pursuit Squadron, later became known as the 99th Fighter Squadron. Then the government had trouble. You can't have flight squadrons without flight surgeons to watch over them. Heavens, we couldn't possibly have a white doctor working with black pilots. The world would come to an end. But it didn't, of course. But how were they going to handle it? They took doctors and put them into flight surgeon school. Now, what are we going to do? We need 2 black flight surgeons. They finally broke down and let 2 doctors attend flight surgeon school with all those white guys. And it worked. Oh my goodness. What a shock. The 99th Pursuit Squadron was given some land interdiction duty, and they did outstanding work destroying earthbound targets. I've never read that this is the reason, but from what I've read about them, I think the reason was they were very aggressive. They wanted to do it right, and they didn't want those white racists being able to say they didn't do the job right. So they ended up doing the job better than the guys in the other units. Then they were taken and put in charge, with others, flying bomber escort deep into Germany. The big bombers had to go very far into Germany, and they needed fighter cover, and so the fighters would fly with them, and by middle to the end of the German campaign, the fighters were able to accompany them all the way to the target, all the way back. There was a tradition that I believed until I was studying for this, that the Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber. It turns out they did. The tradition came from an erroneous article published by the Chicago Defender, and the only documents that could contradict it were classified, and so it stood for many, many years until some of the World War II documents were declassified. However, looking at the statistics, looking at the raids that were protected by the Tuskegee Airmen, we should have lost 47 bombers, and we only lost 25. So they lost some, about half as many as the other people lost. Incredible. How come? The other guys would be flying wrong, watching over the bombers, and the Germans would come flying in and say, "Oh boy, we're going to have some dogfights." And they'd be off trying to see how many German planes they could fight down so they could get flags on the side of their plane and they could strut around as aces. The Tuskegee Airmen set up their own rules of engagement. That was, when the Germans attack, you fight back, fight them off, and stay with the bombers. Our job is not to rack up ace credits. Our job is to protect the bombers. They did. I don't know how you measure success in that. I guess you should measure it by the number of bombers that came back. All I have is the number that didn't. But they only had half as many losses as the enemy, as the others. In order to make sure people understood that their lives were being saved by those despicable black men, they painted their planes with a red tail. So any bomber crew that was saved by one of the, this one's a Mustang, several others, would say, "Wow, that was that black guy that saved my life. Maybe he's not so bad after all." At the beginning of the war, they were called simply Red Tails. By the end of the war, they were called Red-Tailed Angels. Another group that really fascinated me was the Buffalo Soldiers. There were black units who fought during during the Civil War, mostly on the Union side, a few on the Confederate side. At the end of the war, the United States again was expanding, but they didn't believe that we could have black and white soldiers together, so they had old regiments of black soldiers. They gave them work in the West. Part of it was Indian fighting. The United States was expanding, discovering wonderful things like Yellowstone and Yosemite, stuff that needed to be administered, protected, law enforcement coverage, and they assigned the Buffalo Soldiers to take care of that. 1899, the Buffalo Soldiers were out working, and one of them, don't know who, discovered that if you fold a hat improperly, the rain will shed off better than if you fold your Stetson in the standard way. And that's where the hat, the Smokey Bear hat, if you will, came from. 12 years later, 1911, it was actually adopted by the United States Army. I've heard several stories about where the name Buffalo Soldier came from. And they were in various dates, but the one that seems the most comprehensive is also the oldest one, so I got a hunch it's the correct one. And it kind of ties with all the other ones being made up, being derivatives. So let me read it to you. In September 1867, Private John Randall of Troop G of the 10th Cavalry Regiment was assigned to escort 2 civilians on a hunting trip. The hunters suddenly became the hunted when a band of 70 Cheyenne warriors swept down on them. The 2 civilians quickly fell in the initial attack, and Randall's horse was shot out from under him. Randall managed to scramble to safety behind a washout near the railroad tracks, from where he fended off attack with only his pistol and 17 rounds of ammunition. 17 rounds, 70 people coming after him. Private Randall suffered a gunshot wound to his shoulder, 11 lance wounds, but recovered. And I skipped a line. The noise of the battle brought more of the Buffalo Soldiers out, they weren't called that then, and they drove away the Indians. The Cheyenne quickly spread word of a new type of soldier who fought like a cornered buffalo, who like a buffalo had suffered wound after wound yet did not die, and who like the buffalo had thick, shaggy mane of hair. And I think that's probably about where the word buffalo soldier came from. Here we had soldiers that were tough as a buffalo. Buffalo soldiers. Well, we've looked at some blacks who've done some great achievements. We've looked at some blacks who were doing some good things with force. I've called them the enforcers. Now we're going to look at some other ones. We're going to look at some blacks who broke the law. Some notorious black people who broke the law. Let's start, date 1825 in Kentucky. I learned about this in a book. A couple of years ago, I came across the book Pictorial History of Fort Wayne, Indiana. The book is no longer in print. I found an electronic copy that had just the text, no pictures. Very good reading, really long. And then about the last fourth was nothing but election results, and I skipped that. But in the middle of that book, I came across this section. The author, by the way, the book was written, as I show here, in 1917. The author talks a little bit about Quakers coming to the Fort Wayne area, and the author met with Mrs. Charles A. Dunkelberg, whose great-grandfather was Frederick Hoover, who was the leader of some of the early Quakers to come here. He wrote a document in 1829. It was never published. Mrs. Dunkelberger gave it to the author. And in that document, he talked about an incident that happened in 1825. And we know it was 1825 because the document says this was the first year of John Quincy Adams' presidency, and you'll see that in a quaint way as I start reading. And remember, they tended to write and speak in King James English. Now it came to pass in the first year of the reign of John, who was governor of the United Provinces and Territories of North America, that the Ethiopians in the province of Kentucky were sore vexed by reason of their taskmasters. And they lifted up their eyes toward the land of Indiana, which lieth toward the north country over the great river Ohio, as thou goest towards the city of Brookville. Now Indiana is a land flowing with milk and honey. And they said, therefore, let us flee thither. Peradventure the people of the land will deal kindly with us, and deliver us out of the hands of our oppressors. So the people got them away by stealth, and fled into the land of Indiana, and got them possessions in the land. Howbeit, they were sought by the Negro hunters. And then the narrative goes on about the Negro hunters and the Quakers. They went after the sons of Belial. Don't you like the name they called the slave catchers? Sons of the devil. I like that. The Quakers had those guys figured out. Sons of Belial caught Sabi, wife of Isom, and fled. But certain men of the land pursued the men of Belial, and delivered Sabi. In like manner, these certain men rescued two other slaves, George and Jacob. But the children of Ethiopia said therefore one to another, wot ye not that if we tarry in this land, we shall be spoiled of our possessions? Let us therefore make ready, and flee even unto the land of Canada. And the book goes on to explain about their travel up through Detroit carefully, because they were afraid there would be slavers in Detroit, and there sure could have been, because remember, it was illegal to be a runaway slave. It was illegal to help them. It was illegal to run the Underground Railroad. So they had to be careful. And the thing that really tickles me here, you don't normally think of Quakers as being violent. But here, these slave hunters had come in, kidnapped one of their neighbors, so they rode around and everybody grabbed his hunting rifle and they went after him and got the sons of the devil and cornered them and took their friend away from them. And they did it multiple times. Don't normally think about that from the Quakers. What they did was illegal. Like I said, this section's about people who broke the law. And what they said in their heart was, my action may be illegal, but before God, I'm doing what's right. Let's look at a serial lawbreaker. This guy was a one-man crime wave. 1963, 64, 65 in the southern U.S. In Alabama and Florida, arrested all over the place. This character's name was Martin Luther King Jr. 1963 in Birmingham. The evil crime he committed was trying to buy a sandwich and a cup of coffee in a restaurant where blacks were not allowed, or colored was not allowed. He was arrested. Some of the best writings about freedom and equality are in Dr. King's letters from a Birmingham jail. So like Joseph said to his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. St. Augustine, Florida, he just tried to rent a room. He and his family were going to stay in a room, swim in the pool. Got arrested again, troublemaker. Wasn't allowed. 1965, Selma, Alabama, they were trying to develop marches from Selma to Little Rock, several days walk. Dan arrested. Terrible man. Look at all the times he was arrested. What was he saying? In his heart, my action may be illegal, but before God, I must do what's right. Year's 2003. The location is Iraq. Lieutenant Colonel Alan West and his soldiers have captured an enemy combatant. Notice I did not say enemy soldier. This was a man who was a policeman by day and a bomb layer by night. Not wearing a uniform. So read the Geneva Convention. He was not an enemy soldier. He was an enemy combatant. They had captured him. They knew he understood where the next ambush was from. He knew where the explosives were hidden. And he wouldn't tell them. So they said, tell us please. And he wouldn't tell them. And they said, tell us pretty please. And he wouldn't tell them. And they said, tell us pretty please with sugar on it. And he wouldn't tell them. So then they got considerably more aggressive with him. Finally, Lieutenant Colonel West said something to the effect, if you're not going to cooperate, I might just as well get rid of you. He pulled out his sidearm, fired 2 shots into a bucket of sand. Places that use a lot of guns have buckets of sand, so if you need to discharge an arm safely, you shoot into the bucket of sand. Scared the living daylights out of the guy. All of a sudden, he was very cooperative. Told him where the explosives were hidden, when the ambush was to take place, and as a result, no soldiers got blown up, no arms were blown off, nobody was killed. And the following year, Lieutenant Colonel West was allowed to retire from the Army. My actions may be illegal, but before God, I must do what's right. 1955 in Alabama. Alabama was enlightened. They would let black people ride on the white people's bus as long as they stayed in the back of the bus. So what they did was they put a sign in the aisle that said whites and coloreds. So the white people got to sit in the front, black people in the back of the bus. When I was a kid, once or twice we got to ride the bus. I mean, we always had cars. Once or twice Mom let us ride the bus and she'd take us on the bus. And that's the big deal was, we wanted to go to the back where the motor was. Well, that's not the way it was in 1955. Mrs. Parks was sitting in the front row of the black section of the bus, and as white people got on and gradually filled the white section of the bus, eventually the white section was filled. They stopped, another white man got on, so the driver came back, picked up the sign, moved it back a row, and he didn't say, "Pretty please, move back." You know, he said, you know, "You evil, wicked people, get it back," or something like that. Mrs. Parks was sitting there, the other people left. Mrs. Parks said, "No, I'm going to stay here." In her heart she said, "My action may be illegal. Before God, I must do what's right." 1752, Voltaire said, "It's dangerous to be right when the government is wrong." Yeah. Since I was old enough to remember the verse, probably, I don't know, early teens, maybe a little before, Isaiah 5:20 has puzzled me. "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." Thought, does that mean there's going to come a time when we say bank robbers are good and people who don't rob banks are bad? Or people who kill are good and people who don't kill are bad? In the last few years, we have begun to see an inkling of what this means. We have seen Catholic nuns required by law to buy insurance coverage for birth control and abortion. Catholic nuns. Right now in the courts, we have people threatened with the loss of their business, their savings, their homes, because they don't agree with people who want them to celebrate something that their religion will not allow them to have. What they are saying is, my action may not be legal, but before God I must do what's right. And now, the last place. The date is right now. The location is right here. And now to that gut-wrenching question I've had to ask myself in the last couple of weeks as I've been putting this together. Am I willing to join with these heroes of the recent past and say, my action may be illegal, but before God, I must do what's right? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming.